Hello, Dorothy. How are you?
Hi, thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to interview you.
I love talking about how people can be helped with hypnosis. I'm just so thrilled when people can have less pain and fewer symptoms, and I
Amazing.
that's wonderful.
Okay, so friends, we have Dorothy here. So let me introduce a bit more about her and her work. She comes from a very different background from other therapists. She studied biology, human psychology, human physiology, and human genetics. That's an interesting combination. And then she became a research librarian working with scientists and veterans at center combining agriculture and medicine. That's awesome. And then she started studying hypnotherapy with the intention of working with people with chronic pain. So in a while we will find out what inspired and what is the intention behind her intention and
Mhm.
all that from her own words, friends. And then she soon discovered that anyone with chronic pain also had a lot of emotional pain. So there are usually two essential parts: time to focus on their physical issues and time to focus on their emotional issues. Often doing this at the same session is most effective, is what Dorothy
Mhm.
says. So I will straight away get into this question, Dorothy. How did you get into hypnosis?
Well, I had some medical issues. I had mercury fillings in my teeth taken out, and I ended up with severe vertigo. And it didn't go away. I went to physiotherapists, all this. And then somebody told me, listen to a rife frequency, which is a bi or, you did listen to a different sound in each ear. And 15 minutes of a video on YouTube and 2 weeks of vertigo went away
Wow.
and never came back. And I thought, how can listening to a sound have such a physical effect? And so I took some courses on energy medicine, which was all new to me. And then I saw this video of Marisa working with a young woman with cerebral palsy. And cerebral palsy is simply a person having a stroke before the age of 18, usually at birth. And I have an adult son with cerebral palsy. So I paid for a hypnosis session with him. And for a whole bunch of reasons, the therapist would only work with him if I was with him, which was good for me because I really wanted to see what was going on anyway. And during the session, so there was no regression, it was just simply visualization. So visualizing what was going on with his brain, visualizing. So my son, he has a gap in his brain about the size of a large orange. As a newborn, he was born at 27 weeks. He was 3 months early. He was 2 pounds, 10 ounces. He was a bit bigger than a Barbie doll. And at that point, like they can do a CAT scan just through the soft spot in the head. And at that point, he had lost about 2/3 of the infant brain, and they had no idea what would happen to him. He ended up being fine, but he does have mobility issues. He had some issues with his hand. But the toughest part in his life was that area around the part destroyed was damaged, and that caused seizures. So during the session, his hand was in a claw shape, just like that, which is very typical of anyone who's had a stroke. There's an atrophy of the muscles because the brain doesn't control them anymore. So for him, he can use his hand when he looks at it, well, more before, but when he's not looking at it, it's as if his hand disappears. That's the way the therapist told me about it, when he was young. So during the session, his hand opened up. And normally for his hand to open up, it would take a lot of work with the physiotherapy. It would be very painful. So to see his hand relax to that state I was in tears and thought, as soon as I saw that, I thought, I'm going to learn how to do this. Even the next day, he said, "Mom, I really don't believe in your hippie crazy stuff, but my hand has never felt like this." And what was more significant was over the period of time was his seizures became less frequent and less intense. So he took about a day to recover for every minute of seizure. So before the RTT session, he would have a seizure about every 5 weeks. And after the session, his seizures went to about every 8 to 9 weeks. So that in itself was different. But his seizures also went from being about 5 or 6 or 7 minutes at a time to being 2 minutes. So right there, his life changed dramatically. And so for me, when I got into taking RTT, uh, things like psychology, things like trauma, all that was completely foreign to me. It was like a different language.
Yeah.
And then I went to the RTT class, and the second day I was there, this woman came up to me and said, "Dorothy, your aura is wide open. You have to close it." And my reaction was, "What? What are you talking?" This whole idea, it was like she was talking a completely foreign language. So that whole idea of spirituality affecting a person, affecting their health, affecting their well-being, that was also a very new learning curve. So most of my clients often tend to come from a very analytical kind of approach. So I did lots to say, look at this video, look at this video, look at this book, that's partly my librarian background. So when I was starting to learn the the hypnotherapy, I did a lot of sessions of anyone who'd sit still for me, because I was still amazed that I could put somebody into a trance. And really a hypnosis is just I'm sure most of your listeners already know this amazing relaxed state where your body's relaxed, but your mind is focused. That very odd state. And so I do visualizations of their body being in good shape and whatever. So I before I really got ever into doing regression, I probably did 30 people. So if somebody was sitting beside me on a bus and they said, "I've got a sore knee," I would do a session on them. If I was at the hairdresser while my hair was waiting, I would do the hairdresser. I was on the plane, so I'd do people beside me on the plane. When I was at RTT, we were staying at the dormitory at University of London, and the first day I was there, I'm sure this really young girl came up to me and sat with me for breakfast. I'm sure she wondered, why is this gray-haired old lady here at a university dorm eating breakfast? And she was a Chinese student, so she didn't know the words hypnosis or anything. So I gave her a quick demonstration of how she could use a quick hypnosis just to be able to find the English word she would want quickly, that she could access any new English words easily, that any English word that she learned, she had immediate recall, just that 5-minute, quite quick thing. And it was like by the end of our hypnotherapy course, it was almost like all kinds of the students heard from her and all wanted to see us and have a session. And so we'd sit in the lounge and do this group session of English. You can study, you can learn, you can recall. It was great fun. And but partly I went to take the online, the in-person course, because when I started to work with some people, fibromyalgia, anything with chronic pain, they often had severe childhood trauma, which I hadn't expected and I wasn't prepared for. I thought, well, chronic pain, all you deal with is, you know, that there's inflammation, that there's cartilage problems, that there's blood circulation problems, the physical stuff. And yes, there's physical damage, but it's in combination. And it's almost like, especially if a person has long-term stress, It's like those chemicals, the adrenalines and those other chemicals. It's like they act like acid, and then they'll work on a place where there's been an injury, or they'll work on a place where there's some kind of genetic weakness and make the situation worse. And then on top of it, when people have chronic pain, often they're unable to work. So then they add in all kinds of financial stress. So if they're on a disability pension, they have an extremely low income. So then they're often, unless they've got family support, they're living in a sketchy area of town, or they're living in a place that's not a very pleasant place to live in, and they're surrounded by people who may have addiction issues and so I had an acquaintance who was living in this geared to income place where it was mostly people with, so she was one of the first people after my training that I worked with, and so I just go over to her place and she would drag people in off the hallway. So it gave me, so within about 2 months I'd worked with 80 or so people with chronic illness, just dragging them in off of the hallway. And uh, the results were sporadic. It gave me a great lot of practice of using the protocol, seeing people with all kinds of different issues. But when a person's living in a place where they have to be afraid if they have to go outside at dark, how can any hypnosis really help them? So I could help them reduce their pain a bit. I could help them with their other things. So when I started to work with people who paid to work with me, there was a huge difference, partly because maybe they were more invested than a neighbor dragging them in, but also they didn't have that extreme amount of life issues going on. So but even then, usually they would have an issue. Almost every fibromyalgia client I've worked with had sexual abuse as a child. I've worked with about 35 women with breast cancer. All of them would say some variation. They would tell me scenes where a normal reaction is anger, but they would tell me, I'm lost, I feel shame, I feel horrible, I feel guilt. And I'd say, what about anger? And they'd say, some variation of, I'm not an angry person, I don't lose my temper. A woman who had been raped by her father said, I'm not angry at my father because I forgave him before he died, which was sort of denying that at the time she felt anger, at the time she felt betrayed, and at the time she had to bury it, she had to suppress it, because she was a child. You can't really lash out at your parents. You need them to support you, even if they're not the right parents or doing good things. So a lot of what I feel like I'm doing is guiding people to acknowledge what they feel, so that if they can label their emotions, and for me it's very personal, because I had twins who were born premature, extremely premature, because of a complication with the pregnancy. And so it was an emergency C-section. And um, so afterwards, I was reading a lot of autobiographies, stories of people who had premature babies, how they coped, how they dealt with. And about a year after they were born, I read this one book where the mother said, I was angry at the universe. And I read that line and thought, that's me. I had been angry at the universe that, I had twins who were born into so much trauma and so much pain that I even had twins. I didn't want twins. I only want, it's enough to have one baby. But what was amazing to me, and at that time, that's long before hypnosis, was once I could say, yes, I'm angry. And yeah, there's no person to be angry at. It's just the universe. I'm angry at the universe. I'm angry at God that this happened to my children, that this happened to me. And it did go away. So what I guide my clients to really accept is to label their feelings, accept, yeah, those feelings are normal. Any child treated that way would feel that way, and then it goes away. So sometimes what I guide clients to do when they really say to me, I'm not angry, and I'll say, okay, if you walked into a room and your child, your niece, your nephew was being treated the way you were treated then, how would you react? And then they'll usually say something like, I'd be in all guns blazing, I'd go in. And it was like, yeah, and you as a child, you deserve someone to feel that anger on your behalf. You deserve to have someone fighting on your behalf. And then they get it. Their inner child needs that support. And so what happens is if they can relieve that emotional pain from the trauma, the hurt, the anger, the guilt, all those things, which it seems to allow their immune system to be activated enough to let their body heal. The other part I think hypnosis is fantastic for is allowing people to sleep better.
Yes.
And 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 most of my recordings, people listen to them and say, well, I really don't know what you said. By the time you got to about 5, I was sound asleep. And they said, can it still work? I said, yeah, it works even better. And there is a physician that I found fascinating, Dr. Stasha Gomanak. I'll send you her spelling. And as a sleep specialist in the 1970s, she said most of the clinic's patients were elderly. And so she said it seemed to be people stopped being able to sleep and then they died. And she said now most of the patients are teenagers. And she said that, in 30 years, the human race hasn't changed that much. So obviously it's a social change. And her theory is to do with air conditioning. Because before air conditioning, no matter how bad the weather was in the summer, the kids went out to play. And now the reaction is, oh, it's too hot, it's too humid, stay inside in the shade, and plus all the fear of skin cancer, people avoid the sun. And in her experience, especially with people with darker skin, to wear sunscreen, they're even doing themselves worse. So what was found only about 6 years ago is the center of the brain that controls sleep has vitamin D receptors. So with a reduction in vitamin D, that sleep center malfunctions. So, so that's really, really important. And so what there is there's 3, she describes it in this, I'm paraphrasing, there's 3 controls of sleep. So the first center affects your brain and your breathing, and then the second affects your chest and your abdomen, and then the third is your legs. So if you don't have enough vitamin D, or if there's something else interfering, that's when the limbs are affected. So people saying I've got restless limbs, and when my legs start kicking, I can't sleep and stuff. And she describes it as it's like a water pump. And to fix a water pump, you have to stop it and then take it apart. And that for your cells to heal, everything has to stop. So for your brain to, drain properly at night, for your memories to be embedded, your brain has to stop. You have to have that deep, deep sleep. And so with chronic pain, often people will say, I sleep 2 or 3 hours and then I'm awake because of pain. So anything that can slow their pain down so they can sleep, automatically, that's the only time where cells that have been damaged can heal. So hypnosis, by helping people sleep, and so I make recordings for people, and there is controversies about recordings, but when there's physical issues, I think if not my hypnosis recording, then some hypnosis recording or a Rife recording or something, just because I've seen how much difference it makes for people for sleeping. And I worked with one cancer client that was end of life, which is not the result we would hope for. We would hope, it's going to shrink their tumor, they're going to have a radical remission, everything's, but, anyway, her husband called me after she'd passed, and he said that she had more peace because of the hypnosis than she had with other kinds of therapy. But what made the hugest difference for her was she didn't need morphine in great extents. So she was able to be lucid while she said goodbye to her grandchildren. So for her, that was a fantastic result. And so the greatest gift someone who is going to pass can give to their loved ones is to make that transition in peace, in calmness. And so, but more of my cancer clients will say, yes, they're having good results, that it's shrinking, that they're feeling better, or that they're responding to their treatment, they're responding to the chemo better, they're responding to the radiation better. At one point, I did a session for a woman for public speaking. So when I had her into hypnosis, the form, was, why can you not speak? And I expected it to be something happened when she was in school, kids laughed at her, the teacher laughed at her, and it's amazing how often people say the teacher laughed at me and therefore I shut down or couldn't do that subject, or it's just, I mean, teachers really should know how much they have an effect on people for their life. And she had a miscarriage when she was younger, and her sister was pregnant, and she didn't want to jinx her sister, so she didn't talk about her miscarriage. She didn't talk about the sadness she felt, the guilt that she felt. And for about the next 6 or 8 weeks, it seemed every woman I had, no matter why I had, why she came to me, had a miscarriage story. But that was about 1.5 years ago. And in that 1.5 years since, I haven't had one client who said, yes, I had a miscarriage. And this, it was like, so I was almost thinking I'm going to really specialize in women who have had miscarriages. But then they never came back. But for the ones when I was doing it, it was intense, this. So if they were coming to me for chronic pain and they had this miscarriage story, they were often so unhappy, and like that woman in our culture, women who have had miscarriages really don't have an opportunity to talk about it. It's not, it's not totally taboo, but it's not something that people are comfortable talking about. So women who have suffered this can't talk about it. And so I went through that. Recently, many of my clients have had traumatic brain injury, and they have many labels. Several of them have been in car accidents. And where it makes a difference is often, it's almost like a stroke, but it's not quite the same. So there's been some part of their brain that's been hurt. And the symptoms become things like extreme fatigue, sometimes a difficulty finding the correct word to say. Sometimes they'll say, it's like I'm trapped. I know what I want to say, but when I'm really, depending on who I'm talking to, if I'm stressed, if I'm overtired, if I'm really fatigued, it's like I can't think of the word no matter how hard I try, and then it gets worse and I start stuttering and stuff. So by looking at the symptoms, what's going on? And so then we'll do a lot of focus on that they can, their storage system is perfect. And going through the idea that, your inner mind, your unconscious mind doesn't have a place. And this is, kind of controversial, but I've read it in a couple of places. So the idea that your conscious mind is that place behind your forehead, but your unconscious mind is described as your whole entire body. So all the cells in your body work as a depository of information. And I've even read, when you go into some of these quantum psychology kind of ideas, the idea that if you drill down from the cells, drill down to the atoms of the body, at the atomic level, our body is space. There's at that level, there's the atoms have that center bit and then the electrons around it. So there's huge space inside the atom. There's space between the atoms. And some of these quantum theorists suggest that our memories are stored in that space between the atoms. And this kind of fascinating idea, but that's why we can store every memory we have. And consciously, we don't, when an event is happening, we're focused on what's happening, but we're not aware that during that event, this is what was happening to our heart. This was what was happening to our blood circulation. But our memory stores that. So anything that makes the heart beat with fear, that's going to affect the emotional part. So I had one client he was in his 70s and he had slipped on the ice. He fractured his pelvis. He had surgery. And because his hips were out of alignment, he was, this was about 2-3 years later, his hips were, instead of being like that, they were like this. And so he was putting a lot of pressure on the hip joint and it was wearing out the cartilage. And so they were saying, well, he was in so much pain. And they said, you may need a hip joint replacement, where they put that steel bit in. And he was really hesitant to have this surgery. So he came to see me and he said, well, you don't need to do any of that, regression stuff. You don't need to do any of the emotional stuff. My problem is from that fall and the surgery. And I said, no, we're good. So we went back.
Don't touch
And
them.
it was
Don't
simply a
touch my
question.
emotions.
Yeah, you have to do this. So, you're going, if he paid me a full amount, he's going to get the full session.
Yes.
And so it was simply, why are you holding on to so much pain? A very simple question. And he went back to a lot of grief. He started sobbing later on. I mean, it was all about his grief when his grandmother died when he was a teenager. His grandmother had been the main caregiver in his childhood. So when his grandmother died, it was very, very traumatic for him. But he was a teenager and he was a guy. You can't cry. You can't express your grief. You can't express your sadness. And he had held that in for all those decades. And so his sobbing, he said afterwards, he felt this tremendous, wonderful relief. So that sadness, that grief had nothing directly to do with his fall or his surgery or his recovery or his hip. But I believe it had an effect on his immune system. I believe it had an effect on his recovery. So just the process of releasing that grief allowed him to go into, to heal, to move to wellness. So that was the emotional part and very essential. And then I did a physical recording that was all based on your body's moving into balance. Your hips will move to balance. Your shoulders will move to balance. Your spine is perfectly erect, that the cartilage is being repaired, that the scar tissue is softening and diminishing, and even after the session, he got up and he was walking around saying, "There's no pain. It's wonderful." It was the first time since his fall that he could walk with no pain. And so what he,
This all happened within the same session, Dorothy?
yeah, yes, that he came. My session, he'd come from out of town and he did it in person, and so it was.
No, no.
Um,
I'm saying, I'm asking that this whole process happened within the single session itself.
yeah, he came to me, and so it was. I spent about an hour and a half on this emotional trauma, and then I did about an hour, and I made the recording of the physical visualization. That, and what was significant was that about a few days later he saw the chiropractor, and he called me up on the phone to say the chiropractor said, "What's changed? What's going on? Your bones are moving." So because in his recording and in his session I kept saying, any muscle that has to tighten will tighten, any muscle that has to loosen will loosen. I mean, that's pretty general, right? I mean, I'm sometimes I'll use medical words that people use them, but I find usually metaphors work. There's a wonderful metaphor if you work with people with scoliosis of the back, the curvature of the back, about using Lego blocks. Well, I was working on back pain for a woman in her 50s who had never had children, never really been around children. And when I was talking about the Legos, I could just see from her face that this wasn't really, resonating with her. But I knew she'd done a lot of work in renovation with her husband. And so I said, well, you've got a carpenter's laser level. Laser levels, like they shine this laser to make sure the wall's straight. And so I said, you're shining that up your spine and you're pushing things. And anyway, she liked that. And so I don't know if her spine went into perfect position, but she stopped having back pain and she slept better. And with this client who saw he saw the chiropractor and his bones were moving, he went further. By the time he got to me, he'd gone as far as he possibly could with physiotherapy. And then after me, he was able to go further. So I talked to him like 8-9 months afterwards, and he was still listening to my recording, because he said, if I listen to your recording, I don't have any pain the next day. And I would rather listen to a 20-minute recording than take, painkillers and have side effects. And he went back to work. He doesn't need to have the hip replacement.
Wow. And
I
I have a question. I'm sorry. Please continue. You were telling something.
I can talk for no. You. Well, I was saying I worked with a woman who had. This is Canada, we have ice, right? She had slipped on the ice, she'd broken her ankle, but she couldn't see a surgeon for a week or so. And because of her age and because of the kind of fracture she had, they thought she was going to need metal pins put into her ankle by the surgeon. And so I did a whole thing. And in her case, she was another therapist, hypnotherapist. So I figured she dealt with all the emotional stuff. For her, all I did was the visualization. So visualizing that healing crystals are filling the cracks in her bone. There's no such thing as healing crystals that could fill the cracks of your bones, but it's a good visual. It's a good story. And it was, giving a place for the stem cells to attach, to make her bone grow back together, to allow the blood vessels to grow back together. Because whenever there's a break, whenever there's surgery, blood vessels are severed, ligaments are severed, and they have to grow back correctly. And so she listened to this. She said, she had it almost on complete replay. She listened to it all night. She listened to it many times during the day. And when she saw the surgeon a week later, she didn't need to have surgery.
Wow.
So would she have needed surgery without me? She thinks she would have. Did it really? I mean, there's no way to test it. And so that's partly the problem with evidence-based medicine is how can you make a control? I mean, you can only say with the person, how they were before their session, how they were after the session. You can't really say, you know, because the results are so individual. And one of the criticisms of evidence-based medicine, and if you do a PubMed search of evidence-based medicine and criticism, you'll see there's a lot of criticism, because evidence-based medicine is great for the accountants who want to provide the least cost service, but it's not always the best thing for an individual patient. And Dr. David Hamilton or Dr. Spencer or Dr. Bruce Lipton, they all talk about how the mind body can make such a difference, and how thoughts can make a difference. And so hypnosis is simply allowing that idea to become stronger, to become, to become embedded in the person. So you had a question?
Yes. So, Dorothy, um, people who want to have your recordings, so should they first undergo the personal session and then go for recordings, or do you have any specific recordings made for different issues as well?
That's a business goal eventually.
No, no, no. In
uh,
the website of yours, is there any
No, I have a recording I usually have people listen to before a session. That's just a very generic kind of thing. And even people say even that helps them. It helps them to sleep. My goal is to eventually create recordings that I can make for sale rather than having
Okay,
through a
okay.
session.
Maybe in
But I
future
haven't
it's gonna
in
come.
future. Yeah, I haven't done that yet.
Okay, okay. And Dorothy, like you have specifically mentioned, like people with whom who came to you with pain, you worked on their emotional stuff, and then all the pain was vanished, or conditions have improved. Let's say, okay, you already answered with one ankle case where
Yeah.
you did not touch the emotions but still improved. Could you please give, but there is no emotional involvement, only the physical issue and that got improved? Would that be possible? Is there anything
I think emotional pain and physical pain are so connected.
so connected?
I have had people come to me for anxiety, which is sort of a more typical
Yes.
condition. And then as I'm interviewing them, I'll say, okay, and what's going on with your body? And they'll say, oh, I have all these stomach issues. And they don't realize how their anxiety is connected maybe to their stomach issue,
Mm.
or they don't realize, oh, you can also help me with that. Or women will say, oh yeah, and I have these painful periods, or um, so I had one woman, it was for severe autoimmune issues, many, many issues. And she said, I had a wonderful childhood. Everything was perfect. Everything was lovely. Everything was happy. And it was like, that was so untypical, atypical, I guess. And I was like, I mean, so tell me about a childhood scene. Everything was happy, happy, happy. And I was like, it just didn't jive. Everything was wonderful. And so I finally said, tell me about an early scene in school, which is pretty open. And she went to kindergarten. She was in kindergarten and everything was happy, happy, happy. She had this wonderful teacher. The kids were fine. She had fun. And I don't know why I asked her, but then I said, well, tell me about how you traveled from your home to school. Tell me about your school trip. And then she broke down, completely broke down. And it was like, oh, well, when I was born, I had this hip problem and I had to wear this brace, and sort of like the brace on Forrest Gump. It was heavy, it was painful, it was, I couldn't walk very fast, and I had to wear it till I was about 6 years old. And it's like, okay. And then she had this big fight with her mother and the doctor in order to be able to stop wearing it. And then, oh yeah. And then this uncle did this kind of stuff to her. And then, oh yeah. And it was like it was like no wonder she had all this illness and this pain. And so even just acknowledging, yeah, some things happened to me, and just wearing this brace that made her so, because children need to be like other children. So wearing a brace that meant she couldn't run, she couldn't walk fast, she was in pain. That had a huge effect on her. Um, so yeah, a lot of her problems went away. Um,
Awesome. Thank you for exclusively sharing all the case studies of yours. It kind of gives like how beautiful hypnosis works for different issues.
I find it really funny that hypnotherapy for medical issues is considered like a very new kind of niche, because really it's not really talked about more like in the past 10 years. Before that, hypnosis was more, anxiety, when hypnosis in its modern format started in the 1800s by the surgeons who had no they didn't have any anesthetic, so they were starting to use hypnosis for surgery because it was better than having a person pass out with alcohol. And so, I mean, that was the most medical way of using hypnosis, to put a person into a relaxed state to be able to do surgery on them. And that was the original of the modern day hypnosis. And it was dropped because, like morphine was discovered, all that kind of stuff. And yet morphine. And so, because like I said, psychology was a new area for me to read about, reading about trauma, reading, the body keeps the score, all these kinds of books, Gabor Mate, all these people were new to me. So it was like a fantastic learning experience. And then I was reading about why Western medicine is so different from, say, medicine in India or China. And part of it was because in the Roman Catholic Church, anyone who dissected a body or investigated a body or researched a body was labeled a heretic, and the Roman Catholic Church would execute heretics. So anyone who wanted to do medical research was at risk of being executed. And that changed in the 1600s with a philosopher who was wanting to study blood circulation, Rene Descartes. He had this very famous treatise. It's called, in English, it's I Think, Therefore I Am. And this argument said that the mind and the spirit were separate, and the Roman Catholic Church could control that. And the body was just an organic machine. And if people dissected a dead body, it wasn't anything that would affect the spirit. The spirit was gone. And that allowed medical science to develop. That allowed researchers to look into what's happening in the body, to dissect a body, to understand. So, that's how they discovered, and with microscopes, to discover capillaries and discover how blood is a circulation system and that. But that separation of the mind and the body became the foundation of Western medicine. And that continued to mostly even to the present day. Whereas in India, in China, they didn't have that Roman Catholic Church fear. They didn't have this fear that they might be executed if they studied the body. So the belief, the understanding, the acceptance that the mind and the body are united, that you can't heal the body without healing the mind, that you can't heal the body without healing the spirit, that is an integral part of Indian medicine, of Chinese medicine. But it was so completely separate from the basis of Western medicine. So Western medicine allowed huge advances in like surgical kinds of research that couldn't happen so easily in the other paradigms, but at a cost. And the cost was, and that's why psychology developed as something separate from the body. And anyway, this book, and I'll tell you about. So he starts this book with a story of a man who was working on a railway, and this steel post went through his brain,
Oh,
and he survived, and his memory was intact, but his personality completely changed. And so in modern studies, if we were able to take a skull, they were able to do computer mapping so they know the exact part of his brain that was destroyed. And then they've been able to look at people who have had that part of the brain damaged by tumors and see that in certain areas, if the frontal lobe is damaged or hurt, the person doesn't lose, like frontal lobe dementia. They still have their memories, but frontal lobe dementia, their personality completely changes. And that was the beginning of the idea that different parts of the brain control different, different aspects of how a person works. And I think the word was phrenology, the idea of bumps. And they were completely wrong to say bumps on the surface of the skull have any effect, but bumps on the inner part of the skull are where the ligaments that hold the brain together, like everybody has the same area of brains, but they're in slightly different parts. That's like everybody has two eyes, a nose, and a mouth, but they're in different ways. And so the exact location of different parts of the brain in each person is slightly different.
okay.
And the brain itself. And one of the things that seems to happen in people who have had a concussion, who have had brain injury, is that area between their brain and their skull becomes damaged. When they have a stroke, all the damage is inside the brain. And I've had clients, and it's always fascinating to turn their attention inwards and tell me what your brain looks like. And then they'll often say, it's as if I've got a bruise on this part of my brain. And so the visualization is to allow the inflammation to reduce, to allow it to be exactly like other parts of the brain. Well, I had one guy, he said, it's, and I don't prompt them for this. I say, tell me what you imagine, or tell me what you see. And they always say something. And they'll say, it's like the neurons are like firecrackers. I mean, they've seen pictures, so they'll say it's like this part of my brain is like a volcano, and that part of my brain is like a glacier.
Okay.
I mean, when a client says that, when they say it's like my whole brain is purple, it's a dark purple, like a dark bruise. Okay, and then the visualization is, well, if you had a bruise on your arm and it was black, the edges would be a lighter purple, and talk about as that bruise heals, the colors change. So it goes from, purple to, greenish to yellowish to faded. Well, I have them do that with their brain. Just imagine that bruise on your brain. And it seems to be a good visual to talk about it as a bruise is fading away. And the other thing that seems to happen when people have had concussions, when that area between the brain and the skull has been damaged, they seem to be more likely to become EMF sensitive, electromagnetic frequency sensitive, which is surrounding us with everything. So when they, so I have them, take out all the chargers from their bedroom, turn, if they can, turn their, router off, turn their modem off. I've had a few people, I've said, try those hats that have those silver lining, and because the symptoms of EMF sensitivity are very similar to the symptoms of brain injury. So
Okay.
the fatigue, the problems with speaking, problems with connecting with people, that kind of thing. So if, and I mean, I've read a little bit about this, and this is sort of my theory, but if having an injury to the area between your brain and your skull can make you sensitive to EMF, then, where's, how can that help? So I've worked with people to be, because when you're fighting the EMFs, you become fatigued. So if you can be um, resistant, you're not going to notice it, or you will be aware so that you can take precautions. That seems to help. So I see the hypnotherapy as being part of all kinds of other things that they need to do. It's not the only thing. So if they've got issues where they need to work with a physiotherapy, what can I do so they can respond better to physiotherapy?
Okay.
What can I suggest about cartilage in their joints filling in? Talking about, they're absorbing healing energy from the universe, and they have the power of the earth coming to them, power of the heavens coming into them, that their bones are producing lots of blood cells. They're producing lots of stem cells, and talk about the miracle nature of stem cells. And the stem cells can flow to any place, and you can, that kind of visualization.
Awesome. Awesome. Amazing work, Dorothy. It's been wonderful to know your journey and so much research you have put into, and it kind of gave me a complete flavor, like how you were combining different understandings to help clients with resolving their issues from the roots. That's awesome.
Mhm.
Doing an excellent job. And I once again thank you for giving me this opportunity,
Okay.
Dorothy.
Yeah.
It's like I was like, hey, don't stop. Like, go ahead, go ahead. So you name anything. You have all sort of cases as case studies. So very amazing work. This has been my
Mm.
vision and dream to bring different experts under one
Yeah.
platform so
I'm
that
just going to say,
people.
I had one client who saw me for some issues, and she said, well, I'm not sure you can help me. I have bipolar. I was like, okay, well, what does that mean? Well, if I'm in the manic stage, I hear voices. So I was thinking, well, how often does it happen? Well, she was in her 70s. It happened twice when I was in my 20s. Okay, well, I think it's pretty safe to do hypnosis on you then. And what was fascinating was, okay, so she went back to the scene where she heard these voices. And it was a scene where her ex-husband had been beating her and had started to beat her toddler. And she heard these voices saying, get out, get out, get out. And I asked her, well, what would happen? What would have happened if you had ignored those voices? And she got really, really quiet. And then she said, I would have died. And she said, in all the years of therapy she had, nobody ever asked that question. What if you had ignored it? And the only other time, so after she heard these voices, she saw a psychologist, and they said, oh, well, to hear voices, it means you're manic depressive. Or he gave a label to her. And she'd been on medication ever since she was in her 20s, simply because she went to the psychologist and said, I've heard voices. And instead of saying, well, what would have happened if you ignored it? And then the only other time she'd heard voices was also she was in a dangerous situation. And she said, again, if I'd ignored the voices telling me to get out, I would have died. And I said, isn't that kind of like a gift? It allowed you to survive. It allowed you to save your son. And she changed completely. She said, I thought of myself as mentally ill for my whole life. And instead of thinking it as some kind of guardian angel or spirit, somebody was protecting me. And and I think that's, sometimes people just need to ask questions in a slightly different way. And I think that's what we are here to do, is to sort of help a client think about their experiences outside of their box. So think about, what happened to you and what would have happened to you if not, and so that was very, very powerful for her to realize I had a gift. I wasn't that I was mentally ill. And you sort of think, what it would have been like if she'd not had to have that medicine for 40 years? And did she really need it? And she said, I was on the she said she was on the lowest possible dose to have any kind of an effect, but maybe she didn't need it at all. But so I thought that was, so where is that, in physical pain versus mental pain, this idea that that she heard voices and she saved her life. She saved her son, but being mentally ill and on medication, which of course the medication for antipsychotics, it dulls you, it has terrible side effects. So anyway, that was another fascinating client.
Yes,
So,
yes.
but thank you for your attention. I always just love being able to
Yes, it was like,
chat about this.
wow, everything you touch, like you have that kind of tells how powerful the mind is, how important is the mental health,
Mhm.
and how important it is to address the root cause or emotional issues so that the mind body connection is understood more. And such a beautiful work you are doing, Dorothy.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you
It's
very much.
just
And friends,
okay.
whoever is interested to work with Dorothy, what I'm going to do is I'm in the YouTube description. I'm going to provide all the links so that you can directly contact her for any professional help.
Okay. Thank you for your talk. Okay. All right.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Dorothy. Thank you very much. Bye.